We're going to move into percentiles now. You have to have mastered z-score before you do percentile, because percentile tells you something different, but you need to know where on the graph you fall. And that's what z-score tells you. How far are you from the mean in either direction? The percentile tells you what percent of other scores are below you. So if you're in the 99th percentile, you did really well. You beat 99% of the other test takers. If you're in the 25th percentile, that means that you beat only 25% and 75 beat you. So think percentile down. That is what percentile tells you, the percent that you beat. There are some rules, laws, that will never ever change in percentile. You can memorize these and count on them. They will never change. The first law is, no matter what your mean actually is, whether it's a snake length of 18.25 or a test score of 75 or a test score of 100, the mean is always at the 50th percentile. Now that should make logical sense because the mean is the middle. 50% is the middle. That's how you get it. So this line here is always the 50th percentile. That will never ever change. Something else that will never change is that there are 68% of all scores within one standard deviation of the mean. So 68% of all the scores in a normal distribution fall within one standard deviation below to one standard deviation above. That number 68 will never change. If you know that 68 is here and is divided into these halves, then it makes sense that there must be 34 here and 34 here. You can always bank on that number 34. There are always 34% of the scores in a normal distribution here and here. There are always 14% here and here, and 2 here and here. So here's what you do with it. The first thing you do is figure out where on the graph your data point is because of the z-score. So the first thing is calculate the z-score. Then map it. If you have a z-score of 1, you are right here on the map, 1 standard deviation away. If you have a z-score of -1, you're here, 1 standard deviation below. We covered that in the last session. What these numbers tell you is how many percentiles you are from the middle, 50. So here's how you do it. You start at 50, you always just do. You start at 50 and you move towards your data point. If you're moving toward the right, you add your percentiles. If you're moving to the left, you subtract your percentiles. So if your z-score is 1, that means that you start at 50. There are 34 percentiles in that gap. Why? I don't know. It doesn't matter. There just are. You can always count on that. So you start at 50, add your 34. That means that this is the 84th percentile, which kind of makes sense because you beat 84% all of these other people. There were only 16% that beat you. If your z-score is -1, you do the same thing. You know there are 34 percentiles in this gap, so you start at 50. Because you're moving to the left, you subtract now, and 50 minus 34 is 16. If your z-score is -1, your percentile is 16, always. It doesn't matter what kind of data you're talking about. So now you basically do the same thing with these other gaps. There are 34 in this gap, 34 in this gap, but there are 14 in this gap and 14 percentiles here. Again, why? I don't know. I don't care. You can just remember 34, 14, and 2. In fact, you should memorize that. 34, 14, 2. It will never change. So if you have a z-score of 2, that means that you are 1, 2 standard deviations away. So again, you start at 50, you add your 34, and you add your 14 for a total of 98. If your z-score is 2, your percentile is 98, always. It will never change. And again, it should make sense. Only this much beat you, 2%. You beat all the rest of this, 98%. So try it on the opposite side of the graph. If your z-score is -2, you are 1, 2 away, which means 50 minus, because you're moving left, minus the 34, minus the 14, which should give you 2. 50 minus 34 is 16. 16 minus 14 is 2. So if we were to carry it farther, you would see that there are 2 in this gap. So 98 plus 2 is 100. Technically, you can't be in the 100th percentile, so it's just 99.999. And then opposite on the other side. You know that there are 2 here. So 50 minus 34 minus 14 minus 2 technically is 0, but we're just going to go 0.000001. So that's basically what it looks like. It gets a little more difficult when you are in between the gaps. Let me take a time out from the video just to make it easier to upload on YouTube, and I'll come back and show you how we can manage the gaps. But for now, what you need to remember about percentile, the middle is always 50. There are always 34, 14, 2. 34, 14, 2. You start at 50 and move towards your data point, adding to the right, subtracting to the left. And that's basically how you do percentile. We'll come back and we'll handle the gaps in a minute.